I just want to say thank you for being a part of our podcast today. You know how we feel here at Life and Leadership with David Gadberry. We really believe that leadership is the most effective when it's practiced in real life in a real way. And so, as you know, if you follow my podcast at all, a while back, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I did a podcast on it. And really all it was just a kind of an anecdotal, here's my life, here's the diagnosis, here's what I feel, here's what I think is good, here's what I think is bad. And it was really just all about personal experience. But I got a lot of different response from that. Parents that were saying, hey, thank you for saying this, it's helping with my kids. And then just people who may have ADHD and not know how to deal with it or how to embrace it or how to, move forward. And then some about medicine and so on and so forth, thanking me for talking about the stigma and all that. So I thought, you know what we ought to do, if we're really going to talk about this from a leadership perspective, we ought to get some experts in the field and talk about it from a leadership dynamic, because these are important issues and they need to be talked about a little bit more technically. And since I am not an expert or a doctor or anything like that, I've got some friends who are very well versed in these kinds of things, and I want to introduce them to you. So I have two special guests today with me, and one is Mr. Joe Reed, and the other is Allison Morris, and both of them are very good friends of mine. As a matter of fact, we've all done ministry together for many years, side by side in just different aspects of ministry, but we've all also traveled around the world together. Allison and I and her husband, Andrew, have traveled to Cambodia together, and Joe and myself have traveled to Africa together. So we have a lot of shared experiences. And as we were just talking before the podcast, they were saying, this makes a lot of sense that you have ADHD. So knowing me, it is a confirmation of the craziness. So Allison is a PK through 12 certified school counselor who brings a fresh approach to a variety of challenges using a strength-based approach. Now, with the current state of mental health, both the educational system and parents need support more than ever, especially as we've gone through what we've gone through in the last year and a half, 2 years. Allison has 10 years of experience working as a school counselor and currently is the district counseling coordinator for Bigsby Public Schools, where she regularly delivers practical training and works with a large counseling team across the district. So she brings a wide range of experiences and knowledge applicable to today's school climate and educational needs as it relates to the social, emotional, and mental health of staff and students. Allison has comprehensive training in conscious discipline, positive psychology, social emotional learning, experience working with diverse groups, and a broad knowledge of resources to share for continued support and learning. Allison has her undergraduate degree from Oklahoma State University, go Pokes, and a master's degree in school counseling from the University of Central Oklahoma, and is en route to complete her professional counseling licensure. Her favorite thing to do is make memories with her husband and two elementary aged children, and they are great people, all of them. Joe is a nationally certified school psychologist. He has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, a Master's in School Psychology. He's currently serving elementary schools with experience in middle school, college age students, and has also served in multiple capacities, ministry capacities over the last 20 years. So he operated and functioned in ministry for a couple of decades. And I would say that he's still functioning in ministry now because what they do is very ministry oriented, even though it's in the public sector. Joe's been married 9 years to Missy and have two very active sons, Costner and Cal. So guys, how are you doing?
Awesome.
Yeah, doing great.
Good.
I should have beefed up my bio a little bit because compared to Allison.
Well, right, you should have sent it over for proof,
Yeah, listen, compared to Allison, no one measures up.
Oh, right.
She's that awesome. She's that awesome. So I wanted to ask, and either one of you can answer. One you can start, the other can finish, however you want to do it. But I wanted to ask first, what brought you to this place of occupation? Why did you find two things? Why did you find that you wanted to be in counseling? psychology or otherwise, and why education? What prompted you or stirred you in that direction?
Well, I'll just jump right in. I actually have an undergrad in journalism and broadcasting and public relations, really, from Oklahoma State, because really at 18, you don't exactly know what you want to do with your life. And so I had about an 8-year career doing nonprofit work, working in ministry, events, all of that kind of thing. But what brought me to counseling was I was the development director for an agency or an advocacy center for abused children. So I was doing fundraising and events, but what I really wanted to do was be working with the kids. And so at that point is when I applied and went back and got my master's degree, and just knew I'd always really wanted to be in the school setting. I come from a long history of educators, and so I'm a big believer in the education system. And so I knew that through the schools is where I could make a big impact. And I've been in both public and private sectors, and I'm back now in public education, and just really value being able to serve all students of all kinds, and especially in this time right now, the needs are so great. So that's a little bit about my why and how I ended up here. So I was in the Oklahoma City area, Edmond, with my family, and like most people through the pandemic, you really begin to look at your values and what's important. And so we wanted to get back closer to family. My mom is close by. It's closer to my husband's family in Springfield, Missouri. And so, and then we just had some great opportunities open up here in Bixby, being able to work at the district level and work with an amazing counseling team and staff district-wide has been, I'm in my first year here in Bixby. So I'm learning a ton, and there's a lot of work to be done, but there's great people to do it.
That's good. You said something very important. You described that as your why.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, we talk about this in leadership concepts all the time. If you're going to do something, especially something like counseling or something where you're adding a tremendous amount of value to people and you're working with people,
Mm-hmm.
you have to have a significant why or you'll quit.
Right.
And that's the bottom line. You will. So Joe, what's your why?
That's a great question. I'm always trying to remember what my why is, I think, because you need that fuel, right? Especially, I mean, the last 2 years in the world and then in education in general is just brutal. But, I got into psychology, counseling, all of those things because I knew I had a call to ministry early in life. I say early, probably in high school. I had sensed that and then tried to figure out what that meant for me and not for everybody else, because I knew, okay, I'm not going to be a theologian probably. And, I went to Southern Nazarene University. I learned pretty well into my first semester that I wasn't going to be a Nazarene pastor for some theological reasons. And then just like, I just knew, this isn't for me. So I got into psychology and really just knew I wanted to make a difference. And I've just felt like in the school system is one of the best places or one of the most effective places that you can have Bible believing, ministry minded people, because you're with kids 7-8 hours a day. And, they need to experience that light and that love in that environment. So I just the summers off was also, I'm not gonna lie, like that was the pitch when I made the call to grad school at UCO. They said, "Oh, you get your summers off too." I said, "Well, okay, praise Jesus."
Ain't nothing wrong
confirmation.
With that. Yeah, but, ain't nothing wrong with it.
But I just like to, you're in a setting where you have access to students to make a difference in their lives. Yeah. And I just felt like if you can intervene early in a student's life, you can help build a stronger individual who can hopefully build a strong family. And then ultimately we can build a strong society on that. But
yeah, that's good. Janae, you guys both know my wife, Janae, and she's a teacher. And, it's very easy for people in your occupation to feel like you're not making a difference. And just because you get covered up with a lot of things that probably weren't what you signed up for, which is probably true for every occupation to a certain degree. But especially in education, there are certain things that you end up doing that you're like, this isn't really what I want to do. And it can overshadow. But I'll just tell you, knowing both of you and just knowing how things are in the world today, I can guarantee without even being in your environment, you are making a huge difference. And so you should just take stock in that for whatever it's worth, and know that even though it's tiring, and I bet you both are like, Thanksgiving is here and I'm going to give thanks that I'm not working during Thanksgiving. And but I promise you, the tiredness, the weariness, the struggle, it's all worth it, because I guarantee you're making a significant impact. So let me just jump off here with our topic. What is ADHD? What is it? Give me a technical understanding of it, if you will.
Joe, do you have the technical definition? I do if you don't.
Go for it. I've got the DSM open.
Yeah. Go right ahead then, if you got that.
No, a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. And I think the other thing that you have to look at, you didn't ask this, but I'll just
Go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Is that, I mean, we can look at the criteria if you want to go into that of like what is required for a diagnosis, but I think you have to understand that, like, just because I have these tendencies doesn't mean I have a diagnosis of that. Yeah, sure, there are times where I really have a hard time paying attention, but is it all the time? Is it persistent? Is it over a period of time? And I think those are the big things to note, that several symptoms have to be persistent for more than 6 months across multiple settings, and it has to interfere with your daily living fairly significantly.
I'm going to go ahead and ask a question here that I was going to wait till later to ask, but I want to make sure we get to it because you just really brought it up. Allison, how do you feel about, I hear people say all the time, well, I'm just ADD, or I hear people refer to other people as, you're so ADD or whatever. And I tell people all the time, I say, look, maybe you are, maybe you're not, but if you're not, you don't want to be. Right. And so stop saying that. I mean, not that it's going to make you that, but just, it's a real thing, and it can be a hard thing to deal with. Right. So, but my question is that the reason that comes up in my mind and people act like that is, do you believe that our culture, or maybe I should say our society, is socializing people to be distracted or have attention deficit problems? Right. How do you feel about that? And how do you deal with the differences?
Well, ADHD is one of the most common mental disorders that is diagnosed. And there's a variety of reasons, how it is diagnosed. So that's the first part. It's genetic in a lot of cases. If you read further, it can be because of the stress within the mother when the child is in the womb. So there's different, contributing factors. The thing, though, that if you have ADHD, and this is quite honestly the first time I've spoken about it publicly, because I was diagnosed as a child, and then again in my adult life, you build up a lot of skills and you can cope and things like that, but it's and it hits you at different phases, especially with lots of responsibility and family life and different things. But when the term is used loosely or to kind of brush off, it is labeling in a way, and it is almost just dismissing the fact for those that really do have those struggles. So I think it's just like any term we say that can be really hurtful and just derogatory, and not intentionally. But like Joe said, it's got to affect many different areas over a period of time in multiple settings. And the other thing is, I was in fact talking to someone today, and unless you have a diagnosis from a doctor, we don't want to just project or say that child has this or that person has that or I have this. You want to have full information from a medical professional or psychologist before you take that on or say that someone has something. And regardless, we still need the skills. We still need to help with whatever may be going on with that student or individual.
When I got my diagnosis, of course, I didn't think I was, which if you know me, that makes sense. So
for those of us that know you,
I was like, I went, and honestly, I thought, no, I thought I'm frustrated or I'm anxious. That's what I thought. Because I've always had these certain problems. I've always acknowledged it. I know certain things, and I just accepted that this is who I am. This is my personality. And so I would try to change, and I'd pray about it, and I would say, God, help me, this to change. I'd frustrate Janae a lot, but that really didn't go anywhere. But it was when a few years ago, we just faced some struggles, and I was doing a lot of stuff, and it started showing up in anxiety. Like I started having really bad anxiety, like panic attacks, fear for my life, just crazy, nutty, I shouldn't use those terms necessarily, but that's how I felt. I just felt totally out of character, totally disconnected from reality. And so I said, let's go. I'll go. Janae kept telling me you need to go to the doctor. So I went to the doctor, and I really appreciated my doctor because he was very slow to medicate me. He's like, well, we don't know for sure what's going on here. And he said, some of these medicines for anxiety, they're fine, but it can become a vicious cycle, and it can create. So he said, before we do that, let's just talk. Let's talk. And so he just started asking me some questions, and Janae was in there with me. Obviously, I don't know why, but she was. She said, I think he has ADHD. And she just said, and because she's been around diagnosed people with ADHD a lot because she's a teacher, and she saw the same things. And so finally they said, okay, so just to kind of make a long story short, so I went to a psychologist at the Texas Tech place, and I went to psychologist, and he did first a questionnaire asking me all these questions, and he seemed nice enough, and he didn't say anything. He didn't respond to anything. So I thought, I'm good. And then he put me on this computer to do this test and I thought it was much more subjective to this. I didn't know they had like an objective way to find out. And it was this thing where you had to touch the button every time you heard or saw something. And so I got on there, and yes, listen, this is the truth. I thought I killed it. Like, I was like, there's no way I got ADD. I every one of those I got. And then I started realizing there were moments where and this is how ADD does me, or ADHD does me. There were moments that I wasn't distracted, like I wasn't off somewhere else, but I was thinking about what I was doing, but I wasn't doing it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I thought I was clicking the button, but I wasn't, because I was thinking about the whole process, And so I had gotten distracted and didn't realize it. So he comes back in, and after he looks at everything, he comes back in, and and he had told me before, there's not a lot of people, a lot of adults that are, diagnosed with this or whatever. And so but then he walked back in, he was kind of like this, and he said, yeah, you got it. You got it. You got it. And he just kept saying that. I'm like, so I think I was in, someone my age, and I can't remember if it was auditory or visual, but someone my age should be in 85th percentile, and I was in the 20th. And so he said, it's not extreme, but I mean, it's not like uncontrollable in terms of hyperness or anything like that. But he said, but this is bad. And and my other doctor told me, he said, I don't know how you've learned to deal with this. He said, you're obviously doing well. Why, how have you learned to handle? And I said, I don't know. But I had taken a survey before that was asking all these questions about, it was actually a survey that talked about like 25 or 30 coping mechanisms that people will have that have ADHD. And I had every single one of them. I did every one of them. And so that was another indicator that made me think I need to go do it. I think one of the reasons why we should always just stick with the diagnosis and not think that way, because it really helped me in one way. It freaked me out in one. You probably heard my talk about it, and I cried. I'm in 50 something years old, and I cried because I felt broken, and I'd never felt that way before. I thought, because it dawned on me, this is a mental health issue, and something about that just made me feel broke, like that. This is, but then on the other hand, it was like relieved. So obviously, what you guys have seen, I didn't see, but when I ran that test, it made me go, this is it. And now I can feel okay that I knew something was wrong. Now I know it was. So really, honestly, it helped me in the way I behave. That's why I'm saying you should always stick with the diagnosis and not assume anything, because then you behave based on what you think you know.
Yeah.
Right.
So go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say, you said something earlier. And first of all, I think the reason Allison and I can laugh, one is knowing you, but two, it's because it's all demystified for us, like, because we deal with it every day. ADHD is probably one of the most common diagnoses we get.
Right.
I mean, I can't speak for Allison, but I'm assuming.
Yes.
But you mentioned something to Allison about does society make it easier for us to have ADHD or something like that, I think a minute ago.
Yeah, I was just saying, are we socializing people to be distracted?
Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't make it easy, but on the other side of that, I think there's a lot of awareness on just ADHD, but mental illness in general. But I think the downside of that is that it almost normalizes it to probably, like, it just makes it seem like, yes, we should accept people, and we should there should be understanding with people who are diagnosed with mental illness. But now it gets so normalized that someone says, oh, I love to organize my things, I'm so OCD. But like a person with diagnosable OCD, which what you have no idea.
Right.
And so and then that can lead to that victim mentality, because like you said, you start acting like, well, I just got it. It's not diagnosed, but I got it. And so I think that part of that awareness, there's just a double-sided, effect of that that I see. But to pull some stats on you, out of all, this is from 2016, but according to the CDC, if we can trust them, I don't trust this. Maybe in 2016 we could. But 6.1 million people had been diagnosed with ADHD, and that's less than 10%. That's 9.4%. So it's not as common as everyone thinks it is. We feel like it's more common because we see it in school settings or effects of that, but it's not as common. And then you mentioned anxiety, because what does it say here? 6 in 10 have an additional mental illness or behavioral disorder, conduct disorder, emotional disorder, and 3 in 10, that's anxiety. And it's no doubt that would lead to, anxious thoughts and an anxious way of perceiving things and behaving. So it's not terribly uncommon once you already have that diagnosis.
Yeah. I find it interesting how people respond to this, especially parents. And one of the questions I want to ask you guys is, what are it seems like some parents are very quick to embrace that their kids may have this and go right to it and get the resources they need and all that. But it seems like other parents just don't want to go there, and they don't want to. And really, what's shocking to me about that is the school systems now, the way they're set up, at least in public school systems, is they have resources and are required to help you if you'll allow them to. But still, there are some parents that just don't feel like they want to admit, and I think this goes to the behavioral. So I don't want to ask too many questions at once, but I believe this deals with the behavior. You heard me say on my original podcast about this, that my parents led me in a way that was, that my parents are great people. My dad is a great man. My mom's a great lady. They just are good people. You just can't beat them. They're just fantastic people. But they didn't understand me. They didn't get me, but they did love me. Mm-hmm. And part of love is, I want your life to turn out right. So they led me to behaviors and wouldn't allow me to just act any old way. And I can remember being in school, just hearing the teacher constantly, sit down, David, sit down, David, sit down, David, sit down, David. Or I can remember you remember those standardized tests the way that we used to do it? Didn't matter. They didn't matter. I mean, nowadays they matter, but then they were just like, we want to see where kids are. They didn't care. It was no pressure. But I would literally sit there and grip my pencil and I'd get this feeling of, I don't even know how to describe the feeling, how you get that restless, almost like, I don't know how to describe it, but I would get that just so until I would just start drawing and just ignore the test at all. I mean, I don't know if there was ever even a good test.
Bubble art, is that when bubble art?
Yes. Bubble art, that's exactly right. So how do you guys help people know, how do you, number one, how do you help them embrace with their student? And then how do you help them draw a line of, hey, this is ADHD, but this is just bad behavior. And you don't have to accept one because you have the other. Mm-hmm. And then there are some things that it does affect your behavior. And a kid is sometimes, you've got some kids that and I think this is what people can understand. They can't sit still. Mm-hmm. It's not, they don't want to sit still. They can't, like they just can't. So what's your personal experience on dealing with that with parents? And Allison, why don't you share first?
Sure. Well, we can explain too, just from a school standpoint, how we have to kind of go about it, which is much, there's a way to go about it. But when a parent brings that to us or is concerned that their child might have, to me, it's a lot of just education. And I'm a very visual person. And so it's having like the visuals of, like, I love this one. It's like the ADHD, iceberg, which is kind of hard, but what we think it is, and then really underneath all the things that go into it, like losing items, poor impulse control, which we know, or just that poor sense of time. And then just explaining that it's affecting their child's executive functioning, which is that CEO of the brain. And that's all the things from time management to awareness to flexibility. Oftentimes students with ADHD, like, they're just inflexible. They can't bend or change. It's kind of the way they want to do it. So explaining what that looks like. We know the basics of attention and impulse control, but the organization and being able to persevere through things that are hard or uncomfortable. And so oftentimes it's more about bringing that to the table about where they're struggling, their working memory, things like that. And then, they'll say, what do we do? Or, and Joe can pipe in, but depending on where they're falling as far as academically, how it's affecting them academically in the school setting, is I always just encourage parents to, have you talked to your pediatrician about this? Take this to your pediatrician. Here's the things that are going on at school, because that's really where the further information, if there is a diagnosis, really needs to come from. And as a schools in Oklahoma don't diagnose. It's right. Looking at symptoms similar to, in order to provide those academic supports. So mental health is not the diagnosis through the school. And so if whatever's happening, you want an outside professional to diagnose that or suggest, because then you have that information, the treatment plan, whether it is medicinal or not, but even just behavioral therapy, other things. And then that helps the school put those other supports into place as well. So
that's good. So where we can get tools to actually learn how to function is with our medical
yes.
doctor or psychologist or something of that nature.
And
That's
helping
good.
parents understand what that looks like in the school setting. Joe is the mastermind on all the academic and all those sorts of things. And from a counseling perspective, I'm looking at their friendship skills and their conflict resolution and how they handle disappointment. So it looks a lot like that. And just those misbehaviors that teachers come often for support in that area. And so oftentimes students that end up being diagnosed, not always, but when a diagnosis comes back, oftentimes then they're struggling in all of these like social emotional areas as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's I think because of our culture, society, whatever you want to call it, just the way we do things in America or in the Western world for that matter, we don't want to look at things that are complex. I don't think things have to be complicated, but these things are complex things. And we want this, just give me a solution that is quick and that I can just deal with, and then we can just move on. And the thing that has become really apparent to me is this is just an ongoing thing. It presents itself in a lot of different ways. It can be for the person who has it, if it gets out of control, it can be completely, I don't know what you want to say, almost tormenting. The frustration levels can be unbelievable, and the lack of, and it seems like when you go through episodes like that, you become more inflexible. And I remember when I would look back as a young man and not realize why, when me and Janae first got married, I'd get mad about something. I literally pulled the doors off of our dresser. Just the impulsivity. And I thought, why did I do that? I'm not that angry. I'm not that mad. It was just like, I didn't know what else to do. I was in the moment, I'd lost my temper and I just ripped the door off. I mean, you know what I mean? Or I would do things like buy something that I really, just because I saw it and I was just impulsive about it, or, and so I guess one of the things I want to talk about, especially in terms of you both are parents, and you deal with kids a lot, not only your kids. Where do you think we're getting it wrong, or what do you see some changes society-wise or culture-wise that where we need to be careful? And let's start with you, Joe. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's amazing when you become a parent how that question, the answers to those questions change, right?
Oh yeah.
I think one, hard to say, but I think you can't solve your kids' problems for them. And I think we've got to stop eliminating the need to struggle to learn how to solve your own problems. One of the parenting books that I always recommend is Love and Logic, because it's all about, well, how are we going to solve that problem? And you're building their repertoire, and their toolbox. Because if they can't solve their problems, then that leads to less resiliency, less persistence, and then that becomes reinforcing. So you talk about, that cycle of anxiety. Well, if I don't do the thing that makes me anxious, my anxiety goes away, and I like that feeling, so I'm going to do that again. And it just keeps happening and happening. And parents, of course, out of what they love for their child, obviously don't hate to see them go through that, but it's such a necessary thing for growth, right? I think the other thing is it's like always looking for a diagnosis of why am I I have a weakness. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. We all
Yeah.
have patterns of strength and weaknesses, but
Right.
it doesn't mean that there's ADHD or
Yeah.
there's mental illness. Because at the end of the day, no matter what, you've got to learn coping skills.
Yeah.
And whether or not you have, diagnosable ADHD or what, you've got strengths and weaknesses, and you're going to have to learn how to apply those, and you have to learn what works for you. Right.
Yeah.
And so I always encourage parents a lot to just find what works with them. I'm in elementary school now, so it's like, okay, we've got this early. It's okay. This is not a death sentence.
Right.
And just because he or she isn't, it's mostly he's, right? But just because he or she is not flourishing in this setting right now, I mean, it's hard. And especially like kindergartners, what we're doing to them, to like full day kindergarten, and I mean, they're not really developmentally ready for that type of thing. So it's built to be very difficult to succeed, in my opinion. But I think just because they're not like every other kid doesn't mean that they have this diagnosable thing. But on the flip of that is, some people are, right? And
Mhm.
so get educated, but don't let that diagnosis become your identity. Just let it become a part of your story. Because I hate when people say, well, his ADHD, and then you hear the kids start saying, well, my ADHD. I'm like, stop
Yeah.
owning that.
Yeah. Right.
That's not who you are. So part of that is just, I think the big thing I see, in Allison, you may have some other thoughts to share on that, but is just, let's build resiliency, and let's let kids struggle, and figure out how to work their own problems out, within reason.
I really believe that the only way I'm able to be functionally successful in my life, and thank God I've been able to do some really neat things, but it's because my parents didn't know what this was. You know what I mean? And they just didn't allow me to think like that. And I had reasons, like when I hit adolescence, it went berserk, and I lost a lot, and I started trying to cope with the deficiencies in me in a very, very unhealthy way. And I think that what you're talking about here, Joe, and I'd ask you this, Allison, do you think that this lack of wanting your kids to go through this process of working problems out, figuring out how to solve things, figuring out is that causing, at some point, maybe not early on, but later, this retreat into unhealthy coping mechanisms? Do you feel like that happens? Or
Yes, absolutely. Well, and with that comes enablement. So we're just going to enable that.
Yeah.
I don't, it's too hard. I don't want to. And it's easier sometimes, like from the parent perspective, to be consistent and hold your kids accountable and have them do the things even when they're hard, or coaching them through when they're complaining. I mean, it's not fun sometimes. That's just
Right.
the facts. And so it is easier to just kind of give in. And I think we have to just persist ourselves. And really, to kind of tag on to what Joe's saying, is building up those strengths and what is working and what you do well, what that child does well, and focusing on that. So, and that's where some of my training over the last 3 or 4 years in positive psychology is this idea that no matter what diagnosis we have or where we fall, how do we then have a positive well-being and flourish in our life? And it is using our strengths for good and finding those tools that help us. And whether for kids, especially with little ones, and Joe, I'm sure you have every tool in your tool belt, but I'm a huge believer in visuals, like visual schedule, visual what they need to do. When I feel this way, I take a breath. So very visual, because that, with a individual struggling with ADHD, everything's going everywhere. It's like children have described to me, I feel like I have popcorn in my brain, pop, 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 pop all the time. And
Boy.
so
That's a great analogy.
It is.
To calm that, or when I feel this, then I look at this and it helps me get back on track. Or I do, my square breath, and then because then physiologically I come back down. So it's teaching them these skills and explaining how and why it helps. And then they, where do you notice that in your body after you take those 3 big breaths? Yeah. And then they can think again. And that's just in my own life, what I've put into place and with my kids. And on an adult level, my coping skills is, we have to have a bunch as well. It takes a lot of extra. I think that's one thing I wanted to be sure I say for just educational purposes, no matter what your age, when you struggle with ADHD or you have ADHD, it just takes a lot of extra to do the things. I don't know how else to put it. To have your stuff together, to be organized, to be on time. And timeliness is huge. And it's hard for me sometimes. And I would never get out the door if it weren't for my husband. So we have good support system. Yeah. Make the coffee and pack the lunch and that sort of thing. We have our roles because I wouldn't be able to do all of it. And that's part of family functioning as well. So I think it's about teaching, helping us feel calm in our bodies. And so when we're not, what's our plan? So coming up with plans.
I was thinking, I had that popcorn brain thing going when I was planning a church years ago, and every night I'd go to bed and I'm telling you, a million thoughts. And then I heard this guy do a talk and he said, hey, just if you'll do a mental dump and just write everything down, then you can go to sleep. Well, for a normal person, maybe that works. But when I did it, then I was having like 10 and 12 thoughts about every one of those thoughts that I wrote down. I was like, this is not working.
Not working.
Yeah.
It's more than a
some of the things you just described there, I do that. I haven't known why I do that, but I've just learned over time, like if I'm really intensely doing something, I'll start feeling this anxious feeling and I just pull back and I'll look at something else for a moment. And then I feel refreshed and I come back, and I've just done that automatically. But I would love to have a list of, somehow maybe we can put in the podcast notes, a list of some tools that you would recommend, because I want to remind everybody, you also have ADHD. You've been diagnosed as a child and as an adult. And so, so you work with this as well. I find, and I want to talk a little bit about this, but I think Joe had something he wanted to say about that. But I find that structure is, it absolutely is my lifesaver. And but here's what I find that after a season of being very structured, I have moments where I just want to say, I am not going to structure anything. And I know what's coming next. I know that I'm going to be up too late. I know that I'm not going to be able to sleep. I know that I'm going to get in this cycle of being late for stuff and not being able to get things done in the time frame that I want and all that kind of stuff. But there's just something in me at some point that just goes, I'm not doing it. And how do you deal with that? Like, how do you personally deal with that, Allison?
Well, sometimes you just don't. And then you go, okay, get my list back. Like, get it back together for a second. I just think that's part of the reality of what the struggle is. And part of it too, that why we have to really take care of ourselves, whether it be counseling, exercise, nutrition, sleep, all of those things that, but no, for real, is because it does take so much resource that we can give everything to everyone else and then come home and just kind of like crumble. And so, and I'm guilty of that, and that's something that why we have to create those margins too, so that we give ourselves permission, to kind of, okay, I'm not doing this, that, or the other tonight. Or I tell Andy, or you tell Janae, like, I just got to chill, and they get that. But I think there's times where we have to kind of just unwind and then you gear back up, because it does take so much extra. And and being intentional. And I know, quite honestly, when you and I were communicating about this, just that, exercise and just the endorphins and the stress release, a lot of it is physiological. So if you can get that out, then you do feel more balanced and kind of at center to be able to handle that. But
exercise has helped me a lot. Being structured and regular exercise and eating right has helped me significantly. And I think if you can create that structure and create those habits, it gets easier and easier. But I agree with you. I think that part of having this is there's something in my brain that wants to rebel against that. And
you rebel?
Not me.
Should I tell the badge story? Okay, I won't tell you.
No. But Janae has really helped me. She just really is a partner, and
so calm.
She has a good effect. So Joe, what were your thoughts? What thought were you having earlier?
I don't know. They're gone.
Okay.
But I think one thing now I personally haven't been diagnosed with ADHD, though I'm I'm pretty disorganized and I see those things, but I'm not one of those that's I have it. But I've put in a lot of coping skills in my life too. But that structure, do you find that, is it an accurate statement to say that that structure, if you have that structure and routine, that that's just something you don't have to think about. And so now your brain's freed up to think about the other 400 things that are coming in your mind. And so the more structure and routine you build in, it's even, one of the pieces of advice I always give parents and students is, a dry erase board or a Post-it, literally a Post-it on the bathroom mirror, brush your teeth.
Yeah.
It's there when you need it and you don't have to think about it, and then it's gone and you're done.
Yeah.
And so, and then, you talked about exercise, but it's when you have ADHD, it's your baseline physiologically, if everyone's at a 0, if their baseline 0, yours is already heightened no matter what. And so it's you're already starting with the gas on the, your foot on the pedal, right?
Right.
Is that an accurate?
That's
accurate. And I would say too, just not, I wouldn't do this probably, but it's very attractive to me when I hear the stories about Steve Jobs or the guy who is the Facebook guy or whatever, how they said if you went to Steve Jobs' closet, he'd have 12 sets of a black long sleeve t-shirt, jeans, and tennis shoes. And he would just wear that same thing every day because he didn't want to think about what am I going to wear. And that kind of structure, that's what it does for me. It takes me to that place of I don't have to think about other things. It's easier for me to function. And I think for exercise, part of that is just literally just makes me feel good. And I don't know if this is accurate. I don't know medically or technically anything about it, but I just feel like I get this buildup of energy inside that I don't know what to do with. It's how it feels, and so running helps that significantly.
Let me say one more thing
go
about
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
With one less thing to think about. That's why with kids, all ages, just that visual, when I say visual schedule, it's, get dressed, brush your teeth, eat breakfast, get your backpack, make sure you have your homework, all of those things, because it is one less thing and it helps keep you on track. Because that's part of the problem, we're not on track. And so for kids, then they can build those kind of rhythms, just like we have our Google Calendar. They can build those rhythms in, what that looks like, whether, and then if they get off course, well, then they've got it back here. And it helps the adult, whether it's in the classroom or at home, be able to say, oh, let's check your schedule. What does it say next? So it's not this constant barrage of words, because that's one thing. Words is too much, just show or point, which is why visual, probably David, on your test, it was auditory because ADHD oftentimes we're so visual, we need that input. And so that's what's helpful too for younger people, is then it takes the power struggle out of the adult and the child of saying back on track or whatever. It's just point to something, to kind of, that's the signal. So there's not that engagement of correction and that sort of thing.
Do you think it's important? Oh, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like, I know that a lot of students, especially kids, they get treated like they're being defiant when they really have a skill deficit.
Yes.
And part of what our language in our elementary schools is like, okay, let's teach that skill. That's a behavior skill, just like any other skill. And I think that's part of our education to parents as well. I mean, you have two kids, different things work for each kid,
right?
Most likely, but kid that's really struggling with these you mentioned executive functioning issues, you've got to use different strategies and different parenting techniques. And so because their toolbox is just different, they don't have the same tools that 95% of the other kids in that class have.
Right.
And so it's just really important to try to gain an understanding, empathy from that perspective.
Right. The part of that I hate is that a lot of kids who have this or similar things of this or this and other things, a lot of times people will look at them as unintelligent when they're actually extremely intelligent. Yes. Like when I became an adolescent, I got past 5th grade. I was always straight A's all the way through school till I got to 6th grade. And then my grades were horrible. Like when I graduated, I had to take every single class there was on my senior year, plus 2 correspondence courses just to graduate, because I'd lost so many credits because I had just screwed up so much. And I was smart. And about other things, and in other areas and in other ways, was very smart, very intelligent, read. I was well read even at that age. Yet when it came to just that classroom setting and being able to handle all that, I just could not do it. And so my grades looked like, and so I think a lot of times we look at kids who have this struggle, and it's exactly what you said. We say they're being defiant, or they're being rebellious, or they just don't want. And it really has less to do with that and more to do with, we've got to figure out what works for them and pull them along. Or that's where leadership comes into this. Leadership isn't this easy, I'm going to give you a little phrase and you're going to, it'd be great if we could just give little colloquialisms and everybody go, oh, okay, it's fine. But that's not the way it works. And sometimes you have to get down in the trenches and figure it out. So Allison, give us some, give us a rundown maybe of those executive function problems that kids have, or anybody that has ADHD has, and then maybe give us some tools or thoughts, both of you, on what are some ways to figure out what works with different kids, and then how to implement that.
Yeah. Well, so all of there's 9, executive functioning skills. I mentioned some of them earlier. Obviously, we know we're talking about attention and time management and, starting tasks. So task initiation, like being able to get going, so often it's like they just won't work or they can't work. It's like the ability to get going because you get whatever it is you're doing. And part of it is this great sense of feeling overwhelmed, like you were describing, how tense you feel. And self-control, of course, and that, again, that perseverance and flexibility, and working memory. So it's when I'm working, it's pulling in everything to do what it is I'm working on and working within that, time frame, whether it's short term or long term. But we think about, a student or anyone diagnosed with ADHD or something similar, that self-control piece, and that's what Joe said, it's not because I'm trying to be hurtful. Now, if it is, you're going to know the difference. And
Yeah.
regardless, we want to teach skills.
Right.
But when we have that knowledge, that's what's helpful for schools. When we have that knowledge of what's going on, we can see the difference. Is it just defiance, or is it a lack of self-control because it's impeded? But let's teach these skills with things like taking a break, deep breaths. When my body feels tight or tense, I may go walk and get a drink of water. Oftentimes it's those students need the little extra jobs, whether it's carrying a box of, carrying something down to the office. They need those breaks, an option to stand or sit on the floor to do just a change of space. I mean, schools today do not look like they did when we were in school. It's
Right.
just to sit and it can't be, because that's not best practice, and that's not how our kids are learning. So there's lots of different modalities and ways to switch it up. In fact, so what's great about being in Bixby, I'm housed at the 9th grade center because it's right in the middle of all of our school sites. So I have an office, and one of the 9th graders was like, I just get so distracted and overwhelmed. Can I pop in and work in here? It's so quiet. And so sometimes, even if there's just an alternative place to work, I need it quiet. So I think those are just some things I would say.
That's good. Joe, what are your thoughts on just practices how do we identify it, how to work with, different ways, and what are some things that you would suggest? And I'm talking about across the board, not just students, but people in general.
People in general. I think one is, like we've been talking about, is discuss with a physician, right? Like, let's get an accurate picture. Like, do we have a diagnosis? And then the other thing is, like Allison talked about, taking breaks, and I know you just said not students, but across the board. But thing, but schools are so much more well-versed at working with students with learning difficulties now. I mean, it's almost like we're just there. It's expected, right? Because the population has changed. Right. And so, like, we'll do a lot of proactive breaks with kids. We'll do wiggle breaks. This kid's got a wiggle break and they've got a little trampoline, and that might work for a kid. Or they'll come in and do some like kid yoga and then go back to the classroom, and they'll just schedule those breaks throughout the day. That mindfulness is huge for students who are like cognitively able to understand, and adults too. What am I feeling? Is that anxiety about this task or whatever? So what have I trained myself to do when I have that, I have this task list to get done? I mean, for me, if I have a huge task list, I'm like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to go watch The Office. And I'm going to ignore everybody. And then I get this feeling, but then I start to think, okay, how am I going to feel after I cross that first thing off? And so it's just training yourself to be reinforced by that feeling, right? And that emotional regulation piece is huge too, because that, especially impulsivity and that executive functioning that, governs that response piece. That's huge. It takes a lot of just self-training to figure out, okay, I've got to train myself how to respond in this moment. Right. Or with kids, we use zones of regulation. So like, if I'm red, I'm angry, I'm feeling like this is what my body's doing. Here's what I can do to, here's what I do when I'm in the red, or I'm feeling yellow. So here's what I do, and whatever. Yeah. I want to get back to green. Green's good. But and of course there's all this types of research and stuff out there. But part of that is trial and error too. Like, I think you didn't ask this question, but I've really been wrestling with it over the last few years, is because I've had a million parent meetings. And it's like, yes, we want to identify what makes this child unique. We want to identify, and often in the school setting, it's because they're not learning at the pace of another, or it's a negative, there's a weakness, we got to figure it out. But I think it's like, also, just from a Christian worldview, we've got to embrace those weaknesses too. It's like we spend so much time trying to be normal like
Mhm.
everybody else and thinking we should be,
Mhm.
when really we should embrace that part of our life, apply the coping skills, get through it. And I mean, it's like the Bible, what Paul said, like his grace is made perfect in my
Yeah.
weakness.
Right.
And you can, I mean, you talk about that victim mentality. It's like, who can argue with Paul in Philippians 4, right?
Yeah.
I can do all things through Christ, right? Who strengthens me. I've been shipwrecked and I've been abandoned and I've been had plenty and I've had nothing and I'm starving and I've been in prison and all those things, right? It's like, let's use that weakness to become stronger, because
Right.
when you go through that, you talk about the toolbox and the
Mhm.
coping skills you're going to have with that awareness. Like you said, you checked everyone off on that list, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
um and I think you're a great leader because of those
Mhm.
things. You wouldn't be the leader you are with right without
Yeah.
embracing that and going through that.
And I
But
want to,
I feel like I'm brain dumping too, so I'm
no, no,
sorry.
no,
I
that's good.
apologize.
No, it's good what you're saying, because here's the truth. I want to kind of wrap it up with that thinking, because I think it's so good that we're more aware now of mental health issues. You talk about things that we can get out of negative things. COVID, it has been a horrible thing and all that's come with it. But the truth is, it has brought an awareness that there are a lot of people that are struggling with mental health issues.
Yeah.
And it's exacerbated that in a way. And it's also amplified it to public knowledge, where we now can look and go, wow, we need to pay attention to this. Something needs to be done. We are not effectively handling this in our nation. So I think a lot of really positive things are going to come out of that.
Yeah.
Also, I think, like you said about leadership thinking and all of that, I've become far, and here's the big word. I think the big word for people who struggle with any kind of mental issue or any kind of situation like that is awareness. Coming to that place where I was diagnosed, and then just really talking about it, and Janae and I really getting real about it and some of the things I do. And here's the deal. Most people do things and they don't know it. They have a blind spot. When I first came here, we would have staff meetings. And when I would get done with the staff meeting, I'd get up and walk out. I didn't even think about, there's still stuff to talk about. I was done. And let me tell you, that came off as arrogant and ridiculous. And what kind of idiot are you that you would just come in here and dump on us and walk away? And of course, I'd go back in and say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. And people say that is rude. That's just behavior problem. No, it really wasn't. I wasn't even purposefully doing that. Before I knew it, I was out of the room. It's just like sometimes that's what happens. And so, but what has happened over the years of dealing with and handling and becoming aware of behaviors or issues or feelings, like, why do I feel that way? Like, I don't understand why I feel that way, and having to think about that and becoming aware of it. And then just learning to cope with that, whether based on knowledge I had or based on just trying to figure out how to live life, it has made me a more effective leader. It has helped me for some of the negatives that it's brought. It has brought a lot of really good, positive things. And I'm thankful for that.
Well, that's what Joe was saying too. Like, you have to look at what is right. Like, what are your strengths, and how those have helped you to the point that you were, and even with kids, when I meet with parents or staff or whomever, I always start with, what are two of their strengths?
Yeah.
Because it can't just be problem centered. It has to be, we all have those strengths. So we have to look at how to play on that too. So, that I think that's too, a lot of it is mindset. So my mindset can be like, I'm always late. It's hard to, keep myself together, blah, blah, blah. Or my mindset is, I can handle this. I can do it. This is what I'm going to do to help myself be prepared. And I've got my clothes picked out. So it's my mindset, it's my perspective, it's the lens in which I look. And that's true for how we see ourselves, how we see others, how, our teachers and our parents are seeing the kids. And I think part of what I try to impart is always having that lens in which we see the child through. There are some strengths in which we can see, and sometimes that's hard. I mean, honestly, it is.
Especially when you get in this cycle of figuring out something's not right.
Right.
And you're talking about it so much, and you're researching it, and you're listening to people, and you're thinking, and pretty soon, and I think not only because we need to think differently, but also for our child. If we're dealing with a child in this scenario, or even a spouse, or even a person, how would you feel if every conversation was the weakness or the negative, or, you know what I mean? I think we need to, I love that you said that, because I hope a whole lot of parents hear what you just said, because I think we feel trapped sometimes in trying to solve the problem. But let's just think about in leadership context, simply leadership context, not considering ADHD at all. It's always better to play to strengths. Always.
Right.
It's always better. Some weaknesses you need to just not worry about.
Right.
Who cares? If I don't do that ever again, is that really going to make a difference? If I'm doing really well in this arena, I mean, think of the things that, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking to myself right now, and I'm sure you guys could do the same thing, but I'm thinking of the things, the strengths I've developed just to handle the weaknesses in my life. And those strengths have not just helped me, but they've helped other people who I'm leading. So, man, what a great perspective. I love that. Both of you guys have really said some strong things. We obviously have not gotten to anywhere close to this conversation. So what I'd like to do, we don't want it to be too long. So what I'd like to do is just schedule a time to do it again, and kind of take up where we left off, and get, cover some more subjects if we could.
Well, could I just throw, there's a couple, on Instagram, I follow and only choose to follow like positive things that are helpful for my life. And I just want to throw out there, though, I think some things that might be helpful for people or parents. There's a couple that I follow that I could throw out there. Just
please.
So there's one psychologist out of Texas, and her name is Dr. Ann Louise Lockhart. And we could maybe put those in the notes, but she's got great tips for ADHD, especially dealing with teenagers. And then the Child Mind Institute. So Child Mind has excellent resources. And then, of course, Dr. Caroline Leaf, who is a neuroscientist. And this could be a whole other podcast on just how to wire our brains. That's something I've really been studying, because that's ultimately what's going on here. But
it's a great book.
Great. Yeah, just great, practical. There's tons of resource there. So
yeah, that's good. Thank you so much for doing that. We will put it in the notes and make sure because here's what we want to do. We want to be helpful to people. We want people to be able to take what we're talking about and really be practical and let it be of help to them. And I feel like what we've discussed tonight really can be of help. So thank you so much for just being a part of the podcast. We will definitely do a part 2. And maybe a part 3 and 4, and however long it takes to get through what we need to discuss. But I really think it's important. And I think it's important not just because of the ADHD factor and because, that's something that's part of my life. I think it's important that we take leadership into every avenue and aspect. And somebody might say, as they're listening to this, well, what have you talked about leadership at all? And here's what we've talked about. You cannot effectively lead other people until you effectively lead yourself. And one of the things that I have gained from having this issue is I've had to truly lead myself out of negative behaviors, negative thinking, all the things that come with the weaknesses of ADHD. And I've had to lead myself into a place, and basically without as much knowledge as I wish I had. And so I want to provide that in just doing this podcast. We're providing leadership for people to say to them, hey, look, you don't have to be stuck by this. You don't have to be overwhelmed by this. You don't have to be defeated by this. You are more than you think you are. And this is just, I think one thing, and I'll end with this. I think one thing, and you both have said this in different ways. I think a lot of times when people have a weakness like this, they forget that everybody has something. Just because you don't have a mental illness of some kind, if you want to call it that, doesn't mean that you don't have a weakness. And I think people who have been diagnosed, sometimes they think, well, I wish I didn't have to struggle with this, like other people don't have to struggle. But the truth is, everybody is struggling with something.
Absolutely.
And
well, it helps you be a better leader. I think you said it on your first one, because you can understand,
right,
and have a greater empathy and what it takes. So it's even like noticing and affirming,
right.
People all the more like, gosh, thank you for your organization. I really noticed that. I mean, things that we know are hard work.
Right.
So, and the other, I did a quick Google search on, well-known celebrities with ADHD. And I was really surprised to learn like Simone Biles has ADHD, and Michael Phelps, some of these others that when we talk about being successful in life, it's not a deterrent at all. In fact, some of the most successful people struggle, greatly with things. And so.
Right. When I sat down to talk to my doctor about, after I'd been diagnosed, and he was talking to me about medicine, he said, I have OCD. And he said, David, he said, people like us, doctors, counselors, pastors, we're not supposed to have issues. And I think that was one of my struggles, is just admitting that I'm not perfect. No, not really, but just I was being funny. But the truth is, just admitting that something's not broken in me, and to be honest, more than that somebody would know that something was broken. That how are people going to perceive? How do I help them if something's wrong with me? You know what I mean? And that's a lie. That's a lie. It's not. It's a joke. But there is that. Physician heal thyself. It's like there is that stigma that comes with it. And it's probably something we'll have to talk about next time. But I really think that people can look at, different people's lives and say, hey, I don't have to be stuck. I don't have to give up. I don't have to be defeated. Right. This is going to be okay.
Well, there's things like, your doctor told you this, but things like fish oil, D3 supplements, there's things that can really nourish that frontal lobe. And Joe, that's what I tell parents a lot too. Just, look that up. Because there's a lot of research behind those sorts of things. I mean, I'm pumping Will full of all the things. He doesn't meet all the criteria. He meets, how many are there? 6 or
like 6 inattentive and 5 or 6 hyperactive, I think.
Yeah. So he doesn't meet, all of it, but he meets about half of it. So I'm like, he's got the old person tray of supplements.
But I think it's just, you have to embrace though that like that's a part of who you are. It's not a fault. It's a weakness. But here's the thing. It's not normal to be ultra successful. Like if it were normal, everyone would be ultra successful, and therefore no one would be ultra successful.
Right.
And so you just can't let it, like you said, I mean, it's just an overcoming mindset. I mean, I would venture to say Peter probably had ADHD.
Yeah.
And I mean, he's cutting people's ears off, right? Like talk about emotional regulation.
He had
issues.
Impulse issues. There's no doubt.
So it's like we embrace it. We learn what we can to understand it, but we don't let it become our identity. No. And then we let Christ shine through in that weakness, and then we become stronger for it as a result.
I love what you said. I'm going to repeat it as we go off. And that is, it's not a fault. It's a weakness. And that's a big deal. A lot of people, I for a long time, now there are behaviors that you can allow yourself to engage in that are your fault. That totally. You're doing that and you're making an excuse for it. And I get that. But there were some of these executive function issues that can look like bad behavior. And I would always feel so guilty, like, and just like something's wrong with me. And I love the way you said that, though. This doesn't mean you're doing something on purpose. The difference between when you're doing something on purpose and when you're not. And so I think it's really great to look at it like that, and we can all overcome whatever we're facing. So guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight or today or whenever this is. And just get ready for the call, because we're going to definitely do this again. We've got so much more to talk about. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes,
Thank you.
You're welcome.